Welcome to another episode of HSF Conversations, where we discuss theology, spirituality, ministry, and culture. I'm Jesse Owens, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Jeff Jones. Brother Jeff serves as pastor of Hilltop Free Will Baptist Church in North Carolina, and then he also serves as president of Southeastern Free Will Baptist College. And he's been at Hilltop for, not 30 some odd years, but you've been pastor for almost 30 years.
Yeah, a little over 30 years pastor and 39 altogether. I
Wow.
worked 7.5 years as an associate. So, yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, Dr. Jones has taught homiletics at Southeastern Free Will Baptist College, has a lot of ministry experience, and I'm excited he's joining us today to continue our series where we ask pastors about their sermon prep and with the hope that it'll help us
Mm.
as we prepare sermons. So, Brother Jeff, why don't you begin by telling us just a little bit more about how the Lord called you to preach?
Yeah, that's a good question, and one that I certainly enjoy answering. I was raised in Goldsboro, and to be honest, my youth pastor helped me get assurance of my salvation whenever I was 15 years old. That was Fred Caraway at the time. Dan Patrick was my pastor, and after I answered the call, or after I got saved, in our youth group, Caraway had us do devotions. We'd have to write out different answers to questions. He had 5 questions for whatever text, and I just noticed, Jesse, that as I was doing that, and I would say studying, but as a kid, you're just trying to get the questions answered.
Yeah.
God started dealing with me about full-time Christian work. It's amazing when you get in the Bible how the Bible works.
Yeah.
And it wasn't long before I went to Fred and said, "I believe God's calling me into the ministry." And by the time I was 18, I had answered the call to preach.
That's wonderful. I should say to our listeners, I've had the privilege of knowing Brother Jeff for a good portion of my life during my probably at least teen years, maybe preteen years. Brother Jeff spoke on several occasions at Sylvan Park Free Will Baptist Church, where my dad pastors, and stayed in our home. And it's really been a joy to know him all these years. And so the personal relationship is a big part of this. And I've had the privilege of hearing you preach quite a few times, and so I think our listeners will be benefited by your insights. So let's just start with selecting a text to preach. Um, how do you determine what it is that you're going to preach on any given Sunday? And so, maybe you preach the books of the Bible, but how do you determine what you're going to preach?
That's a great question, Jesse. And I will say in response, I certainly love your family. Frank, your dad, is probably a man with as much integrity as any man I know. And I believe I met you the first time preaching at Trinity Camp in Alabama, if I'm not badly mistaken.
That's very
I might
possible.
be wrong, but yeah, I
Yeah.
believe that is it. All right, let's go to your question. I I've been preaching the books of the Bible for all the years of my ministry, over 30 years. When somebody joins our church, they'll even say, "Well, I preached when he was in this particular book. I came when he was preaching through this particular book." Here's how I've done it for years and years. I will preach from an Old Testament book, and then I'll preach from a New Testament. I go back and forth. Um, I will say to any young preacher that wants to start preaching expositorily and systematically through the Bible, my strong suggestion is that you would preach through the book of Genesis in the Old Testament because that's how it all began. And it's difficult to do this one, but it's a great study for your church. Preach through the book of Revelation after that, and then preach through the book of Romans because that's really God's systematic theology book, I jokingly call it. And
Yeah.
it is God's theology book in that sense. And those are three good books to start with. Now, what I've been doing for years now is I've been going back and looking at what I feel like our people need. For right now, we're doing the book of Galatians. I've been in it for like a year and a half now. And we'll be finishing up this coming Sunday, and next Sunday will be my last two sermons in the series. But I wanted people to actually not get caught up in legalism because I think it's very possible that we can in traditionalism. So I addressed that through the book of Galatians. The Old Testament book, I did something extremely unique this time. I went through each of the minor prophets and I did what I would call an overview sermon on it. It wasn't really truly expository preaching, but I did each of the 12 books with an overview. That was my study of the Old Testament because I realized I'd never covered the minor prophets. And it's hard to do that for just one sermon for a book, but especially with like 10 of the 12 being really coming down hard, it almost seems like you're mad or something when
Yeah.
you're doing that. But you
Yeah.
study the prophet, you know exactly why I say that. And I told the folks, I said, I hate to tell you, but it's another mean sermon, you know. So I started it out, and then we would open up and give you the theme. And people smiled a lot. We had a good time with it. And then I went, from previous to that, I was in the book of Philippians. I wanted people to not miss the mission of the church, which is the overview of Philippians. And so I just go back and forth like that.
Yeah.
And it's worked for me.
That's great. Okay, so you go back and forth between old and new. I think that's helpful. When you're choosing from the old or you're choosing from the new, are you thinking about maybe specific needs that your congregation might have so that there are plenty of books you could choose from? I mean, obviously some of them you've already preached, but are you thinking about the needs of your congregation?
I'll give you a good example of that. I feel like we're in a sexual revolution right now. I think we have been for the last several years. And if you study through the book of Proverbs, what you're going to see is really it's random themes. I wish it were. And so when I tackled the book of Proverbs, I didn't go through it chapter one, chapter two, chapter three. I did it based on themes. And so I addressed what does God say concerning our sexual revolution, and
Hmm.
we actually did a series of sermons of each of the texts of the book of Proverbs. And then we went to what does the Bible say about wisdom, and we had a study on wisdom. And so we stayed in the book of Proverbs a while, but we covered those themes because
Yeah.
it really was facing what we're facing as a society.
Yeah.
You can go
That's
back to those, by the way, pretty much all on our website still.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, if you'd love to hear some of these, go to Hilltop's website. Let's see, it's hilltopchurch.com, and you can check those out. Um, yeah, okay,
And
so
by the
you
way, if
go
you
ahead.
let me say this too, if you don't mind, if somebody wants to see the sermon outline, what I actually take to the pulpit, I actually put that online as well, and you can even see. I'll give credit for those that I'm reading behind too, a little bibliography at the end that they can see if they want to see the sermons themselves. Click on the bottom left, and you'll see the actual manuscript I take to the pulpit.
Okay. I'll put a link to those in the show notes for this. Okay, so you've chosen a text, you've chosen a book of the Bible that you're going to preach through. Let's think a little bit about the actual sermon prep, so the process of preparing the sermon. And I'll ask you in just a little bit, thinking about components of the sermon or even resources for commentaries, those sorts of things. But just kind of overview, 30,000 foot view. What does your ideal week of sermon prep look like? Obviously, you have a lot going on, so there probably aren't very many ideal weeks. But in an ideal week, what does it look like? You might say, on Mondays or Tuesdays, I try to do this. Wednesdays, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's really been more difficult because of the college for me now. But I say difficult. I pretty much live life in a rut, Jesse. And here's how I do it. Tuesday and Thursday are my college days, and even though I'm the president of the college, the reason I accepted it was I was able to hire my own COO, overseer of the college, and that's obviously Ken Cash. And so Ken really runs the day-to-day affairs of the college, and I go on Tuesday and Thursday, and I teach my homiletics classes, and I will do the admin meeting on Thursday. So I have to work around those schedules. So a lot of mornings, and I am an early morning riser. I think you already know that about me. I'm usually up by 4:30, 5 o'clock every day. It's just been, I would love to say I stayed in and slept. I just can't. And so
Yeah.
I think I'm wired high or something tight. But anyway, I'll get up and I will, the church doesn't see me until noon on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday's not necessarily true, but Monday and Wednesday for sure. And then I'll use my afternoons on Tuesday and Thursday to fill in my study time because I don't need those times
Hmm.
to study. And I will honestly tell you, there's been more than a few times lately, and most of it's because of my commitment to the college that I've had to actually go into some of what I would call family time to actually finish sermon preparation. But by Monday, I know what my pericope of the text is. I've pretty much decided that, and that's not even a complicated thing. Most of you, if you look in the Bible, it's going to divide it up pretty well for you on any. And I don't try to reinvent the wheel, but a few times I've disagreed with that. But by and large, it'll give you the heading, and I'll select that as, and I'll be able to look at it and say, well, I'm going to be preaching, 18 sermons through this book because of how it's broken down. So I'm gonna read that in four translations. That sounds so complicated, but it's not with Logos.
Mm.
It automatically goes to my preferred study, and it'll put and I just put the text in of exactly where I am, and there I'll see it in all four of the translations that I read. And I've actually expanded it to five lately because I have the King James and the New King James, but I will also read the NASB. And I've been stuck on the Holman and Christian Standards, the same thing, but the Holman translation and then ESV. And that just helps me really. I read it and understand it. And by the time I've read that, I pretty much have got my theme down. I think you've got, if you're going to preach an expository sermon, you must have a theme. So I'm going to write that theme on a 3x5 card. I usually take it and you'll see it taped on the bottom of my computer screen. I have it almost looks like an airplane, Jesse. I've got a big computer screen. It's curved, and it really is. But I do that because it's just I love to have it large and in front of me, and so
Mm.
I'll do that, and I'll just start jotting down what I see as main points that'll marry itself to that theme. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 points. Sometimes it's four. If it gets beyond 4 or 5, I really think your sermon's going to be too long. My
Mm.
goal was to preach 35 minutes. I preach with a timer I do it for myself, but I have to do 2 Sunday morning sermons back to back. And so it cannot be longer. It's going to go into the second sermon or
Yeah.
second service. One's at 9 and one's at 10:30. We've been doing that now for the past year plus because God's been good to our church. And so I'm just
Mm.
trying to accommodate uh, the attendance. And so we do that. But Monday, by the time I put my head on the pillow, I have my theme and I usually have my breakdown of at least the directions of the points.
Mm.
Tuesday, I'll get up and teach my class at the college. I'll get up early and go over that, so I'll be prepared. I might work on it some Tuesday night, but usually Wednesday is going to be my dedicated day to finish Sunday morning sermon.
Mm.
When it's finished, and it's always in handwritten form, manuscript, I turn it over to my secretary who's been with me a long time. You know, Judy.
Yeah.
Um, I think Judy set up this call for us,
Yeah.
but Judy will then type it in outline form for me, and then on Friday I take that same sermon and I highlight it. Yellow means main points, green means sub points, and then my emphasis is going to be orange and a blue, and they mean something to me. But I color coded, if you will. You'd laugh if you saw it, but it works for me, and that's what I take to the pulpit to preach. So there's a week for you. How's that?
No, that's I think that's great. You mentioned
It's
log.
overwhelming, isn't
No, no, I think
it?
that's great.
Overwhelming.
I even think the highlighting thing is helpful. That's helpful to think about, when you're looking down at the notes you have, how are you kind of quickly seeing what you need to see, and what is it? So no, that's extremely helpful. You mentioned resources. You mentioned that you use Logos. Thinking about commentaries, tools like Logos, other resources. What sort of resources go into sermon prep? Do you use other resources outside of those?
No, I have, obviously, if I could show you my office, I have plenty of books, but Logos has changed my it really has enabled me to streamline my study.
Hmm.
I would recommend it to any pastor because even when I'm in revival or off preaching somewhere, I just take my computer and I have a lot invested in Logos, and Logos is probably carrying, I don't know, 6 7 thousand books now for me
Hmm.
in the program. It's just I have an allotment I get to the church house has for books, and I pretty much now buy them electronically. Hardly ever, with few exceptions, am I doing actual physical books. I better not say that because I do still have some old ones that I trust and will go to, but Logos has really been a game changer for me. All right. Um, if I'm preaching through a book, I'm going to talk to, and there's even, I can't remember the website. I could probably find it. I wish I had it in front of me. I go to that recommends conservative um, commentaries that you can trust, but I'll look and I'll buy five on the Logos program.
Hmm.
I'll buy five every time before I study that book. I bought Scott McKnight's book on Galatians, and man, he's good. Uh, I don't endorse this man and everything, but William Barclay has been helpful for me in Galatians right now. I'm just telling you what I'm doing now. I always get Warren Wiersbe. I mean, Warren Wiersbe is a staple. He's going to make it simple. And then I'll pick this time. I'm trying to think, who else am I using? I almost want to open the Logos on the other screen and tell you who I'm reading right now because I will pick and stay with about 5 to 7 commentaries and I will read them all. And man, you'll get a good perspective of what the text is saying. Dr. Piccarelli has some good stuff on Randall House, and
Mm.
Randall House, a lot of their books are on Logos as
Yeah.
well. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm.
Out of curiosity, when do you
And I
go ahead?
go ahead.
When
Okay,
do
I
you
wanted to say this. You go. Sorry,
All right. Now there's
you're fine.
a little bit of a lag. I apologize. When do you
Okay, that's okay.
when do you turn to commentaries? And I would say in homiletics, you teach this. When do you recommend your students turn to commentaries? So, this balance between trying to form our own ideas of what we think the word says, but then also getting insight from experts and scholars on the text. How do you do that, or how would you recommend it?
Sure. I jokingly tell the guys in homiletics, I want you to be able to get your theme and to really have your main points before you ever open a commentary. I said, but if your assessment of that passage has every one of those commentaries that they're in disagreement with you, you probably need to go back and
Yeah.
rethink it.
Yeah.
But I honestly, I've never had that happen to me, and you probably haven't either. So that's a little tongue in cheek. I'm gonna have I have the breakdown of the passage before I ever read the commentary. I'm looking at the meats and the bones onto the meat, or excuse me, meat onto the bones at that point. And I'm a Wayne Big Deal fan. I really love his mindset of
Mm,
developing a sermon. I do believe that he's wise in first you seek to explain it. And I'm giving you stuff I know you would do as well as a pastor. But first you seek to explain it. It's got to be simple. You want to illustrate it. Is there a way that somebody who's skeptical, you can answer their question? That's the argumentation side of it. And
mm,
then you want to apply it. Um, I think every introduction of a sermon needs to have context and something to grab your attention. I
mm,
think you need to have one theme in the sermon, and I'm giving you more than you want, but I'm just giving you the overview of how I develop a sermon. I'm married to that theme all the way through. Introduction, I want to grab your attention. I want to give you by way of illustration. I want to give you context to explain what's happening in the text. A lot of what I'm doing right now, I start every sermon off reminding them in Galatians that what Paul was fighting against. These Judaizers coming in and wanting the Gentiles to be circumcised, and then these
mm,
dietary laws, and we know what happened when the committee from Jerusalem came, and man, I made much of that, but you don't understand why that was a problem if you don't have the context. So context, one theme, points married to that theme, and in conclusion, tell me what to do with what you just told me,
mm.
and I'm going to use that method reading commentaries.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
No, that's great. That's great. Um, all right. Tell us what part of sermon prep you find most difficult. So, some people have a hard time with introductions, or some people struggle with application or illustration. Is there a particular part that you find difficult, or more difficult than others?
Well, yeah, I'm going to go back to teaching homiletics right quick and tell you what I've noticed with our younger generation. I believe today more than ever, you have to preach with an apologetic approach because when I was growing up in a generation before you, Jesse, man, my dad was unsaved, but he believed the Bible was true. So
Mm,
apologetic preaching was really a waste, almost a waste of time, because I wasn't skeptical of whether it was true or not. I believed it.
yeah.
Today, I think you have to take a step beyond that. And so I think the argumentation of the four, explaining is not that hard to me. You read 3 or 4 commentaries on a passage, you already have a good perspective of it. Explaining it's not difficult. Illustrating it can be challenging, but you can tend, if you're not careful, just to make yourself a hero of every story. You should never do that.
Mm,
But when it comes down to what's going to connect with people, you're going to have skeptical people in your congregation, and you better be able to answer their questions, or they're probably not going to come back and hear you next week.
yeah.
I think that's the hardest approach is
Mm,
to put the argumentative side and apologetically approach it.
mm,
And to me, I try to do that more than I did 20 years ago preaching because your generation and even the generation following you, they don't they don't they don't start where I started when I was a young man. The
mm.
Bible is the inspired inerrant word of God. I know it's true. They don't start there. And you
Yeah.
better explain why you believe it is true.
Yeah.
Does that resonate with
No,
you?
that's great.
Because to
Um,
me,
I, that's wonderful. How do you is it mostly instinct that you anticipate those objections, those sort of mental objections people might have, or is it partly through conversations you've had with people maybe um who have those objections? How do you typically arrive at those? Or do this is a controversial topic, or how do you anticipate those objections?
that really is a good question, and I think some of it is instinct. But number one, I've pastored a church for over 30 years, and so I
Mm,
get to hear I receive the emails. We're in an email age. I will receive an email, I dare say, once or twice a month on somebody that's just not connecting with what I'm saying, or they have questions about the authority of the Bible or
mm,
think veracity of Scripture. How do you know it's true? So I look at it that way. I think by instinct. When you study, I'm going to look at my 3 points, and we jokingly say 3 points in a poem. Let's say
yeah.
I have 3 points, and to me, the Bible is truth, and I know it is. But I'm going to look at it and I'm going to say, what kind of things have I heard lately? What would so and so say about this text? And I'm going to try to answer that question in my sermon. And I think that again is the most needful in this generation.
Mm,
But I do believe it's kind of common sense and instinct
yeah.
because people are going to question you if you leave, and you're
Yeah.
going to remember those questions when you're studying.
Yeah,
And I
that's
think
good.
that's how I do it.
That's good. Kind of along those lines, just I'm always curious. Do you listen to preaching? Do you listen to other preachers some to just I mean for your own edification or even
Yeah,
just to kind of learn some things?
I used to more than I do today.
Okay.
I used be addicted to Adrian Rogers. I think he's in my opinion, the greatest preacher of my lifetime.
Mm,
He makes it so simple and yet he's brilliant. I'm an Adrian Rogers fan. Okay, I'll say that unequivocally. Probably not a sermon he's preached I haven't heard somewhere along the line.
yeah.
All right. With that said and done, time moves on and we don't want to be left behind. And I become more of a podcast listener.
Mm, yeah.
Um, every morning I'm getting ready. I'm listening, and I do catch a couple of political podcasts too. But mainly I'm gonna listen to Al Mohler in the briefing every morning, and then Kurt Skelly has a podcast about in the gospel. I really like him. Scott Pauley has a podcast. I'll catch his sometimes, and he is more devotional in his. Kurt is Kurt Skelly and Kerry Schmidt. I said Kurt. Kerry's in the gospel. Kurt's name's a different one. But nevertheless, those guys will actually hit some cultural topics that we're dealing with today, and I like to hear what they have to say because I think they have a better pulse on the young society than I do, and so I like to hear what they have to say. And I'm a podcast listener almost all the time now.
Yeah. I can relate to that. My experience is probably similar to that. On the Adrian Rogers line, I grew up listening to, Adrian Rogers in the car. I think almost every day we had about a 30-minute ride to school. So I think I heard the majority of my Adrian Rogers sermon going to and from school. One of the things I always Adrian Rogers, I would say, as I began to preach, could be both encouraging and discouraging in the sense that his sermons were so incredible and so edifying. But then I also thought, I can't even get close to that. Like, what am I even doing?
He's got the voice. He has the voice. He is a. Some say he preaches simple, but see, I'm one of those that believe his IQ is extremely high because
Mm,
he can take the complex and make it simple. He is
yes.
gifted in that, and
Yeah.
so, man, I am an Adrian Rogers fan, and I did what you did. I've listened to him, but he has been gone a while, and to be
Yeah.
honest, I try not to listen to like in Galatians. I've heard no Adrian Rogers sermon, and let me tell you why. Because I'll copy him if I hear him first.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I don't want. I'm not going to plagiarize, but I declare he breaks it down so
No.
good that it's better for me not to do that.
I think that's a great insight. When you hear something really good like that, it is tempting to, again, not to plagiarize, but it's like, okay, I need to find a way to work that in. So. Okay, so you've got your sermon, you handwrite it out, you have your secretary then types it out for you, you highlight it, those sorts of things. As far as what you take into the pulpit, is it a full manuscript with your highlights? What do you take with you into the
So
pulpit?
it'll be an outline form, like
Okay,
main points are highlighted yellow, and it usually is a statement, a sentence statement, and then the sub point will be really it's going to have two, maybe three sub points. They're always dark green highlighted. It's my method. So when
sure.
I'm preaching a sermon, I'm looking for the next large yellow if it's I'm going to point two, and I'll see my transition then at the bottom because I try to have a transition system,
Okay.
sentence in there. The last statement. Again, you can go online and see all of my sermons and see. I wanted to have a systematic flow: one, two, three, A, B, C, and yellow and green. I can find where I'm at in the sermon and kind of even recognize I need to rush it a little bit more. If I'm at point two, halfway done, and I'm at 20 minutes of the sermon,
Mm,
I'm going to have to high step a little bit to finish because I definitely try to finish on time. Going to do again because of two services, I can't go long.
sure.
Everybody at my church is happy to. So,
Yeah.
so anyway, yeah.
Yeah. So you do okay. That's helpful. So it's mostly an outline. Again, our listeners can go and view that. I'll put a link in there. Um, but you even write out transitions though. I think that's helpful. Sometimes it seems like sermons and I would say sermons I hear from students often lack transitional statements, which makes it seem quite abrupt. So you're writing those things out. You're taking those with you.
Yeah. I'll have a little note that you'll look at the last thing, and it's usually going to be something that will make it make sense to go to point two or to go to point three. I think the hardest transition is always from introduction. The most important one to me is from introduction to your first statement or point.
Mm,
And again, I'm an outline guy. I'm not a manuscript guy, even though I do write it out pretty thorough. It's still outline form. It's not paragraph form for me.
okay.
I could not do that. I would tend to read it if I did that.
Yeah.
You better have to memorize it or you're going to read it. So,
Th that is the danger. That's the danger for sure. I've seen some people do it really well, and then I've seen it not done very well. So totally understand that.
I know some
Um,
excellent preachers that I love are manuscript preachers. You're right. And I don't know. All I can figure, I don't even think they mind me saying it. Randy Sawyer is a manuscript preacher, and he's one of the best expositors in our movement. And I just know you'll have to memorize it really well if it's not in outline form.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's definitely true. Okay, so preparing yourself as the preacher. Um, how do you typically do that? Thinking about um, kind of letting the sermon come to bear on your own heart, your own life, thinking about the people that you're preaching to. How do you prepare yourself to actually preach the sermon, kind of spiritually?
I hate to quote Adrian Rogers, but he's the one after what we just said, but it's true. He's helped me in my younger days. He said I refused to preach unfelt truth. I would go to
Mm,
Jacksonville back in the day and listen to him preach. I did that for several years, and he made that statement to us preachers that he refuses to preach unfelt truth. And what he was meaning by that, and what he went on to explain is more than one time he's been challenged by his own text to know that his life needs to be in line with what he's preaching. And so, Jesse, full disclosure, man, I will stop a sermon while I'm working on it and get on my knees right there in my office at home
mm,
because I know I need to get that part right. You can't preach unfelt truth or you become a hypocrite. And I
mm,
don't want to be a hypocrite in the pulpit. So I think all of us have elements of hypocrisy in us. Um, as a pastor, I'll even tell my people, Jesse, I'll say, look, this is hard for me to preach because God was whipping me before I ever got in the pulpit
mm,
to talk to you about it. And I think our people like the reality of that. And
mm.
they know
Yeah,
me well. And I'm just honest. The Bible is a two-edged sword. It does cut both ways, doesn't it?
yeah,
And man, it
yeah,
sure does whip me.
yeah.
Uh, so,
That's great. So you never want to preach unfelt truth, and I think that's right. And it's not to say there aren't great speakers who can't, I hate to say perform, but you know, deliver something that maybe they haven't really wrestled with. But I would say most of the time, certainly over a sustained period of time, thinking about pastors, people can tell the difference when you've personally engaged what it is that you're saying. Yeah.
there,
Um,
there are
uh,
evangelists that have 30 sermons that they preach everywhere. But as a pastor, you're not doing that. And I'm telling you, the Word of God does work.
Mm,
I have a sermon I entitled that "The Word of God Works." It works, and it works on me. And I'm as real could be when I'm preaching. And I know you were about to go on, but I just had to say that because we are not. I do a lot of preaching outside of my pulpit now. I have probably 30 sermons I could preach and never look at the note, and
mm,
we all do that. But I have found I'm a lot better when I preach something I'm even on the road when I'm going somewhere. If I preach something I've been preaching lately, because God, it is genuinely in my heart. It
yeah,
genuinely has changed me,
yeah,
and I've found I just did revival for Scott Coghill, and I think of that whole week I might have preached one sermon I knew well, and it was a wonderful meeting together because I was giving them fresh things from my studies.
mm,
And even Scott said, "Man, it's been a good meeting for us." And anyway, I challenge every preacher to preach what God's doing right here, and you'll be a much better preacher, even if you are called to do a revival or you're preaching at a college chapel or something of that nature.
yeah, yeah. The kind of the overflow of what the Lord's doing in your own heart. That's great. All right. One last question. As someone who has been preaching weekly, to as a pastor to a congregation for decades, what advice would you give to maybe young pastors or maybe even pastors who are a little ways into it, that you think could help them in their sermon prep? There may be a specific thing or a couple of things. What would you say that you might think would help some pastors in their sermon prep?
Can I give you two instead of one answer?
Let's do it. Yeah.
I want to address. Good. I want to address the young pastor first, and then I want to talk about sermon prep, um, because both are needful. I just remember 20 years I've been teaching homiletics. I had a young man in my office yesterday that's very discouraged because of conflict in his church, and your tendency is, well, I'm just going to resign and find another church, but you're going to have to develop some thicker skin as a pastor. There's going to be conflict in whatever church you go
Yeah.
to. I've been here 39 years, but that doesn't mean everything's been perfect or not had conflict or somebody doesn't say something about you. And I know that's not about sermon prep, but
Mm,
if you're discouraged about just having conflict, you're going to have to come to grips with you're not going to win. If you want to win friends, what is it Jim Coleman says? Go sell ice cream. Everybody likes ice cream, but
yeah.
people people are going to stand up against leadership sometimes, and so that every pastor needs to be prepared. And that doesn't mean you need to move on. Difficult days sometimes mean you need to really nail your furniture to the ground and keep going and get this church where it needs to be. And so I'll say that first. We need more guys to stay and really develop strong churches in a biblical leadership structure and that you just can't leave every time you have difficulties. I'm
Yeah.
finding a lot of that with young men. I'm just being I'm
Yeah.
answering what I want
Yeah.
to say because obviously young people are hearing this podcast as young
Yeah.
pastors and so that is the all right. Here's the difficulty now for study. It's called discipline,
Mm,
and there's only so many hours in a day, and I have to if I'm going to give out, I have to take in, and I have to study, and if you're a gifted orator and you think you can sustain that without getting by yourself and breaking down scripture and doing the hard part, you need to allot at least 20 hours a week that you're going to prepare yourself in sermon prep, or you're not going to have anything to say. And
yeah.
here's what I would say, Jesse, your people as a pastor, they know if you're paying the price in study or not.
Mm,
Um, and we act like it's more spiritual to be at the hospital, and it is. We need to do that. I did it yesterday. We're going to have to be there. Now, our church is large enough. I have a care pastor that goes, but when it's serious, they want me. And I
mm,
was there yesterday. You'll have things just always clinging for your time, and that's just part of life as a pastor. But if you don't discipline yourself to study, you are not going to build a strong local church. They depend on you to discipline yourself to study. And I'd say to every young man, get a tougher hide. You need it,
mm.
and discipline yourself to study.
Yeah.
Those are the two things that I would emphasize. And this, I didn't know a single question you're going to ask me, even though because you said it last night. But that is the best question of all because I think young people need to hear that.
Mm,
I'm fixing to be 6 years old. I think I know a little bit about what it takes, and you've got to discipline yourself
Yeah.
if you're going to be successful.
Well, that's a good
I,
word, and
I
I
really
agree.
believe I did
Yeah, no,
that.
I agree wholeheartedly, and I appreciate you saying that. That's something that I think we certainly need to hear, and that's something that churches need is they need pastors to be disciplined. They need someone who's willing to stick it out and stay for the long haul. You know, if you want to see change, you want to see a church grow in its commitment to the Lord, and even numerically, it's not going to occur by going from place to place. So I appreciate you saying that. Well, Pastor Jeff, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you all for listening to this episode of HSF Conversations. We hope the conversation is helpful for you as you think about how you prepare your sermons each week.